So we entered this room. Around the table were perhaps a dozen visitors, most of the military, mentioning that I had recently been an advisor at the province level in South Vietnam. People stopped and looked at me, and one said, "I've always wondered what happens at the province level." The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan remind me of the issues we faced back then. We just didn't know who to trust among the Vietnamese. Who were the sympathizers and who were the enemy? Who could you believe? The U.S. military saw this as an organizational problem. They thought it could be solved by reorganizing the way the Vietnamese fought the war. The U.S. had developed a system for coordinating intelligence collection. But America didn't want to be viewed as a colonial ruler forcing its policies on Vietnam. Our orders were to persuade our Vietnamese counterparts to implement the system at the province level. As if that would overcome the lack of motivation, lack of will, and lack of honesty in the Vietnamese military. We couldn't get them to do anything. We weren't trained to deal with the Vietnamese people and their traditions. Our military leaders didn't seem interested. But we had unlimited faith in organization and bureaucracy as tools of war. That led to a breakdown of communication between those of us at the province level and those planning the war from higher up. How does the typical American in the early 1960s wind up in Vietnam? I agreed to go into the Army in May of 1966, and I was commissioned and went to Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry school training. The culmination of the infantry training was escape and evasion. What to do if we were captured by the enemy. At a predetermined point, you were allowed to escape. Your job was to find your way back to safe haven, and to do that, you were supposed to not get captured again. Well, I think I was the only one who got captured twice on the way trying to get back. Next was combat intelligence training. How to identify the enemy, how to classify them, how to collect intelligence about them, and put them into some kind of analysis of what was going on. In August or so of 1966, this was still based upon the Korean War. And so we had maps with information about large units moving here and there, and it really had very little relevance to what we were going to find in South Vietnam. And my own view on the Vietnam War was that the worst, I thought it might have been misguided, but I couldn't conclude that it was immoral. that there was some justification for assisting a nation that was resisting a takeover, even if it were kind of a civil war. Midway through the training, we got our orders. The Army had designated for South Vietnam the 4 corps. I Corps ran along the DMZ. 2 Corps was Central Highlands to the west and then the coast on the east. 3 Corps was the area around Saigon. And then 4 Corps was the Mekong Delta area. 2 Corps was where I wound up being sent in the province of Ninh Thuan and in the town of Phan Rang. And there I was assigned to be part of Advisory Team Number 39, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the MACV. We were there as advisors who worked in parallel with the Vietnamese officers who were in charge of that province, the ARVN, a kind of parallel military structure to that of the South Vietnamese military. So you had a commanding officer at the corps level who advised the commanding general of the ARVN unit, and then on down the line with various officers, including what we would be, which were the staff intelligence officers, the S2. So that you really had no true civilian leadership anymore. It was all based on a military structure. One of our tasks in the intelligence business was to observe the province that we were in. The guerrilla warfare primarily consisted of Viet Cong units, often in the mountain areas. They would come down from wherever they were hiding and enter hamlets. We would get reports overnight about these episodes and then set up ambushes. I was part of the 519th Military Intelligence Battalion. The Intelligence Corps was not part of the regular Army unit, and we were assigned to these advisory teams. We had dual loyalties. One was through the American stream of intelligence collection, and the other was working with the Vietnamese military. We would spend part of the day doing our own analysis, writing our own reports for the U.S. military, and then meeting with our Vietnamese counterparts. We were supposed to help the Vietnamese understand the information that they were collecting. Here I was, a 23-year-old with about 6 weeks of intelligence training. My counterpart, the senior Vietnamese intelligence officer, had been in the business for at least 10 years. The idea that we could teach them much was a bit presumptuous. I used to go into these hamlets and I would hear sometimes the children, sometimes the women saying, Trung we mapwa, mapwa. My interpreter told me Trung we stood for lieutenant. Mapwa meant very big, maybe very fat. It wasn't too clear what exactly that meant. That was what I was worried about. And so I said to him, I've got to do something. I said, what's the word for handsome? And he said, Trung we dap thai. So after that, whenever I'd hear somebody say Trung we mapwa, it's Trung we dap thai, which would they thought was hilarious, of course. There was a great deal of friendliness on the part of most of the Vietnamese people for the Americans, even by people who might otherwise have been under the threat of Viet Cong retaliation. But even with the Vietnamese military forces, there was a dichotomy between the true believers in the cause for resisting what they saw as communist takeover and others who were willing to deal with the Viet Cong or with their sympathizers. The regional forces and the popular forces. Effectively, well, they weren't very effective, but they were a National Guard kind of unit. Very little training, some of them with no training at all, often with very old, inadequate weapons. There would be a small group of men, sometimes elderly men, who would take turns at night and guard the hamlet from intruders. Sometimes they were successful, oftentimes they were not. A small group of these popular force people, they had seen an ARVN, an army truck, headed towards an area that we considered Viet Cong controlled. They stopped the truck and were holding it and the driver. And in the truck was a load of American medical supplies. These popular force people were offered more money than they would ever see in their lives by the driver to just forget about this and let him go on. And they refused. And they held them until we arrived. Tracing back the origins of this truck, we found that it had been under the command of the operations officer in the Vietnamese army, who was part of the province structure. The man that it was generally agreed was the most effective officer in their whole organization. He was considered to be the kind of person we could really work with. What all this meant was that he was, at the very least, willing to sell these medical supplies to the Viet Cong. Now, here were these Popular Forces folks who took this great risk to their own lives and at the cost of a very lucrative payoff in support of the cause. And here is this Army officer who was highly admired and aggressive, who may be the one betraying him.
The Central Highlands, the Wonson Cordillera, are a mountainous, largely jungle-covered region. Military strategists on both sides of this struggle are agreed that he who gains the highlands will have won the fight for Vietnam. Villages of the highlands are inhabited by many races, known to the outside world by the French term montagnards, or mountain people. They are known to themselves by such tribal names as Rade and Hmong, are vastly different from the light-skinned lowlanders whom the world knows as Vietnamese. Through these mountain villages for more than a decade have passed increasing numbers of communist guerrillas. The montagnard on his own ground is a formidable ally. A man of great personal courage, the montagnard holds the key to a strategically vital area of Southeast Asia. If he can be won to the government's cause, the guerrillas' jungle sanctuary in the Vietnamese highlands will disappear.
What is corruption under these circumstances? Well, the district that was in the northern part of Ninh Thuan was dominated by montagnards who had a very difficult time with most of the Vietnamese who treated them as second-class citizens. They had a district chief there that we were working with who was ethnically Vietnamese. When we went up to these hamlets in that area, we would be asking the Popular Force people how they were getting along, what they needed, etc. And they kept complaining that they were hungry, that they weren't getting enough rice. Well, one of the ways that they were rewarded for their service was the rice which the United States provided. It would eventually go to the district chief, and the district chief would distribute it to the Popular Forces. We realized that the district chief had to be siphoning off rice, selling it on the black market, and cutting back on what he gave to the Popular Forces. This kind of corruption, we thought, was truly outrageous. And so we began what turned out to be a long campaign to get rid of him. One day, my colleagues and I noticed that there were literally hundreds of montagnards walking along the road or coming down out of the mountains, some of them crying. They said he was the best district chief they'd ever had, that he was the first one who had treated the montagnards fairly, and that all in all, he was the best guy they'd ever known among the Vietnamese. And here we were, the proud Americans, that we'd made sure he got out of there. As I said I think I said to the colonel, we should have just paid him directly, to keep doing what he was doing.
Control 1, Control 2. Control 1, Control 2.
3-1, go ahead.
With Phan Rang Air Base right nearby, we would often get calls from the Air Force pilots coming back to the air base who, for some reason or another, had not dropped their ordnance on their original targets. And since you didn't want to land with ordnance on board, they would ask us for any targets of opportunity that they could drop their bombs on.
Control, White 1.
462 will be coming back with unexpended ordnance.
Any problem?
You wound up sometimes not much more than picking a dot on the map where there might be some VC somewhere. There is a darker side to the colonel, often related to his desires to become a higher grade officer. One that I remember vividly involved a decision that he made about defoliating part of a mountainside. Because the technology or the weapon system was available, the colonel thought he ought to use it. Where he decided to use it was in an area that we had only rarely been able to even see from our aircraft. The mountains were covered with clouds, and the aircraft could not safely get into them. The Montagnards lived high in the mountains often. They would burn off a section of the mountainside and then plant and then move on to a different section. Now, we'd had a number of reports, and it probably was true, that there was some infiltration of Viet Cong down through that area. But it tended to be an area in which both sides sort of left alone. Some of us argued that, we'd never had any hostile fire at our aircraft while we were traveling in that area. But the colonel was insistent, and one day we saw come into the offices a crew of kind of older Air Force pilots with fluorescent scarves around their neck who announced themselves as the people who effectively delivered Agent Orange. A few weeks later, our Air Force observers went up into the area to see what the result was. For the first time in our experience there, they heard rifle shots at the aircraft. They reported that to the colonel at the briefing that night, and of course, the colonel turned to me and said, "See, I told you there were VC up there." And I think I held my tongue, but later pointed out that they didn't shoot at us before, but who wouldn't shoot at an aircraft now after we dumped all of this shit on them and we're killing their plants? The American advisors lived in a compound that was located along a main highway that ran between Phan Rang and the air base. And along the highway, there was a pipeline to carry jet fuel. One Sunday afternoon, we were relaxing in our rooms when we heard screaming and a loud explosion. We saw the small huts that people lived in across the way in flames, and then dozens of people either on fire or running away from the fire. The pipeline had developed a leak. Either that or the native Vietnamese had been using some of the jet fuel for their own cooking purposes. We ran back to the compound to get blankets or anything we could to help put out the flames. I noticed one of our surgeons who was standing nearby but not reacting. I said to him, "Why aren't you helping?" He showed me his hands and said, "These are hands that have been trained as a surgeon. I can't afford to risk them and risk my future in order to help these people."
1130 block of aircraft is back. 028 to code 3. Yellow 1.
Grab me for all three.
Roger. 877, calm. 814, code 3. VHF transmitter not. A4, white 4.
Yellow 1 control.
Yellow 1.
Grab you, Herberg. Yellow 3
Roger.
control. Red 1.
Green 2, green 1. Green 2. Black 2. Are you going to set it right now? Roger. Shotgun, white 1. Roger, I'm waiting for it. Good.
The work of intelligence, there really are two components to it. One is to record incidents of contact with the enemy. We'd get reports of 3 VC having entered a hamlet and conducted an indoctrination lecture. And so, with the help of my interpreter, we would interview people. There was a civilian component, representatives from the Central Intelligence Agency, that was the advisor to the National Police. There was the information that we received through American sources to pinpoint areas where Viet Cong or NVA units might be located. The second part was collecting information reported by agents. These created the greatest problem in terms of evaluation. Without knowing the agents, many of them would have to be classified as F, unknown. Most often, the information itself would be unknown. We'd get a report, for example, that an NVA battalion had moved through this mountainous area on its way south. Possible, but there was no other evidence of it. It was either unlikely or it was at least unknown. We didn't know who the agent was. And part of the reason we didn't know who the agent was because of the Vietnamese system of not sharing much information about their agents. One of the other problems associated with this was that the various Vietnamese intelligence agencies refused to share information about their agent with one another. This really complicated our lives because one of the things that you would like to have is to get the same or similar information from two different sources. So now we've got this NVA battalion moved through this area reported by one agent, perhaps coming through the Vietnamese military, and we'd get a report from the National Police that their agent had seen an NVA battalion coming through the area in a similar fashion. One would like to conclude that that was accurate information. The problem was we were never sure that it wasn't the same agent selling the same information to both of the different services. A building had been blown up in the downtown Phan Rang area. 2 construction workers had been killed. Vietnamese construction workers, these were. It evidently had been a Viet Cong operation. None of us could understand why this particular building or these people might have been targeted by the VC. We were informed that the advisors to the National Police would be arriving in country on Air America. The people who were coming were obviously CIA people. The Viet Cong knew that these two individuals were agents working for the Central Intelligence Agency, but we didn't. There had been an uproar in Washington by President Johnson, and he had told the CIA to send people and get them out there to get more information. My image of the CIA functionary in our province, I'd never seen him come out of his house, never mind do anything even a little more risky. It did not surprise me at all that he was not calling in. He was notoriously a man who liked his alcohol, liked some of the young women from the area. A lot of the people who'd been assigned to these provincial roles had never been out of the office in Langley, Virginia. They were desk people, analytic people, something like had happened to me in terms of being sent out into the field. We were, as intelligence officers, brought to Saigon to be briefed on the Phoenix program. The Phoenix program was an effort to try to improve, on one level, intelligence collection coordination. It also aimed at the identification of the individuals within the normal hamlet village operations, but who were secretly part of the Viet Cong apparatus. And the point of that identification was to then conduct assassinations against them. The program was really aimed at identification of individuals, ostensibly civilians, who would be taken out as potential leaders of a Viet Cong government. The program, as it was to operate at the province level, was with the establishment of an intelligence tactical operations center. Wherever intelligence was being collected from all sources would be brought together and shared. When we asked what the Vietnamese knew about this, they said that they had asked the Vietnamese commanders to institute these things, but they had decided against it. And so we were supposed to persuade our colleagues and counterparts at the local level to do this so that it would be in place, and then the ambassador could simply tell the president that it now already existed. Well, there was no way that the Vietnamese lieutenant was going to institute a system for sharing information unless he got direct orders from higher authorities. And so our ability to really do this was very limited. But the controversy about whether or not either an individual or that the United States military is justified in assassinating people who have not, quote, done anything that we know of yet as participants in a plot to do something is obviously of a very difficult moral question. We had problems associated with the use of force and extracting confessions out of prisoners. One technique involved the use of the American military field telephone. We called it ringing somebody up. This field phone that you generated a electrical shock by winding up would be used by attaching the bare wires to perhaps a finger on one hand and a toe, or in some cases to genitalia. That depended on the mood of the operatives. One day I walked into an interrogation of a Viet Cong prisoner. The Vietnamese, our counterparts, were using this telephone as a way to encourage him to speak. We asked them not to do that, told them they should not do that, and then basically had to leave. They did stop for a while we were there, but I'm sure it probably continued afterwards. This goes along with things like threatening to throw people out of helicopters if somebody didn't talk. Clearly, that kind of psychological threat was used. South Korea had sent a couple of battalions of forces. We didn't have much contact until one day we got a call that 3 Vietnamese woodcutters had been killed in an ambush that had been set up by the ROKs, the Republic of Korean soldiers. These were innocent people, although they were near areas that we considered free fire zones. The problem for the woodcutters was that was where the wood was. And even though they weren't supposed to go in there for their livelihoods, that's where they went. Well, early one morning, the Koreans had set up an ambush along a trail and evidently had cut down these 3 woodcutters. Already, there had been an offer made to compensate the families of the woodcutters with great apologies, but the Vietnamese were looking for some other kind of compensation. We agreed to meet with the ROK commander. We approached him with the question of, was there some other gesture that they thought the Koreans could make? The commander talked with a few of his aides, and he came back and he said, would it help if we returned their ears?
Continuing my message. I'm down here at our sector headquarters on duty again tonight. So things are very quiet. I'm just passing the time away. I've been rewriting some of the reports that we have to put out at the end of every month. They certainly put out some ridiculous reports in this country. No wonder Johnson thinks we're winning, because nobody wants to tell him that things are really going fairly badly.
This would have been in the middle part of 1967. The U.S. Army sources were doing a reanalysis of the numbers of Viet Cong and NVA troops that we were confronting. At the same time, coming down through the Vietnamese chain of command, they were getting the same requirement. They were to do their analysis of the size of the enemy force. Basically, an attempt to finally figure out not only how many Viet Cong military there were, but also this infrastructure, this parallel governmental universe that existed. Maybe even going down to sympathizers who would be part of the Viet Cong effort. And it resulted in what came to be known as the corral reports. We were going to round up all of the enemy in a corral kind of situation. The Viet Cong had a political military structure that was parallel to that of the ARVN. They had a province chief and they had various levels of command that would be like the shadow government if and when they took over the province. Only a few weeks before, the 101st Airborne Division had conducted an operation in the province on an area identified as the location of the Viet Cong's province chief. We had a pile of documents that appeared to be lists of people and gave us some ideas about troop strength. The measure that was being used was body counts. The commanding general of the 101st Airborne was very disappointed in the number of bodies identified as Viet Cong. And so he questioned us why they didn't find more VC there. We said something to the effect, what did you expect to find there? You found the province capital. And they said, well, we had these reports about NVA battalions. And we said, I think, sir, if you look at those reports, you'll see that we consider those reports either doubtful or F6, unknown, unable to classify. Well, obviously, they had never looked at the classification and never looked at that. They just read whatever the report was. And so you learn that it wasn't working, that up the chain, they were simply interested in the numbers and weren't paying any attention to the evaluation. Coming back to this corral report, we developed some numbers about the size of the Viet Cong force that operated in the province. A few weeks later, the colonel called us in and said that Saigon was not happy because our estimates of Viet Cong strength and those of the Vietnamese did not match, and that we should reconcile them. We asked what the Vietnamese had offered, and they had said some much lower figure than what we had come up with. He says, what do you think this means? And I said, Colonel, I don't think they want our higher numbers. I think they want the Vietnamese lower numbers. He finally decided to send them the Vietnamese numbers, afraid that he was going to alienate his superiors if he continued to argue the case for the higher numbers. A few weeks later, I met with some of my friends who were still at Tan Son Nhut, a major base known as Pentagon East, and they were operating there as intelligence officers, looking at the big map of South Vietnam and receiving reports from around the country and making the order of battle, what units were where and how many were, et cetera. And they said, you've got to come over and see the new order of battle map that we've created. We've gotten all these corral reports and we now have numbers for people. We think we have a picture of the whole countryside. I had to say to them, I think that's a wonderful map. We've got a nice diagram, nice setup here. I said, there's only one problem with the map. We sent you those numbers, and we know those aren't the right numbers, The numbers that we were talking about tried to be inclusive of everybody who might be a part of the enemy force. The Vietnamese were willing perhaps only to look at the numbers of people in the kind of official military position. There were different levels of commitment to the Viet Cong cause, and it was very important to know whether or not there were people in the hamlets who were sympathetic, even if they weren't the military people. And so that was part of the disagreement about how to count the enemy force. Our position was that there were many more than the Vietnamese were willing to admit. One of our colleagues responsible for briefing General Westmoreland, the commander in the entire area, and Ellsworth Bunker, who was the ambassador at the time. He had been concerned about the fact that they were going to have to justify these much larger numbers than had been used before by the American military to assess the nature of the problem. Instead, he said, there was no reaction from them except for a discussion between the two of them about how they were going to present these numbers to Washington. It was probably less the case that Westmoreland was fudging the numbers than it was that the whole bureaucratic system was designed to fudge the numbers before they got to Westmoreland. By telling us they didn't want the higher numbers that we were getting and giving them, they were telling us to keep them lower. The political atmosphere and the political leadership are obviously vested in a certain policy, and they don't like the bad news being brought to them. So we contributed to that. We made the compromise of changing our numbers to meet the expectations of those people above us. virtually everybody that you saw could tell you what day they were on in terms of the 365 days that they were scheduled to be in country. You had to worry for people who were very new to being in country, but also then when you got short, when you were only a month or so away from leaving. One of our observer pilots, who also was getting ready to return home, was on a reconnaissance mission and saw a truck driving up into Viet Cong controlled area. He fired off his M60 machine gun, planning to strafe alongside of the road as a warning to frighten the driver. The rounds strafed the truck itself. The driver fell out of the truck and turned out to be killed, something that he didn't mean to do. In this war zone, you felt you ought to be doing something that would make a mark as part of that war effort. And it was a dangerous kind of psychology that took over. And I felt that this guy, in some ways, had that. He hadn't had any real confrontation with the enemy. There would have been the possibility of an investigation. As it was, we were able to construct a reasonable case that this individual had to be either dealing with the Viet Cong, paying the Viet Cong, or in some way cooperating with them in order to be in that area. And as far as I know, that's as far as that went.
How did you feel about covering it up?
Well, I had some moral twinges about it, especially in retrospect. The government of Vietnam and of the United States offered its apologies. There was compensation paid, and I often wonder how that individual feels about the episode, whether that continues to be a thought. But I know at the time it was something that had really bothered him a great deal. The American military went through a very elaborate set of codes for identifying people, that it would be a mistake to use real names. I was known as Silver Lightning Alpha 2. So we're out in this little operation in this hamlet, and I get a radio call to Silver Lightning 2 Alpha that your son, John J. Murphy, has been born, which of course broke all code violations and the like. But I remember spending the rest of that day taking pictures of children, just trying to imagine, what my new son looked like. Each month, there would be a junior officer from one of the teams who would be assigned to go to Saigon to pick up a satchel full of money, both military payment certificates, which was the American currency, and a thick book of official papers. I wound up having to do what we called the pay run. We had to fly out to an advisory team that was experiencing attacks by a North Vietnamese battalion virtually every night. Needless to say, I was particularly interested in getting to them early in the day and leaving before nightfall. It took us a while to figure out where their landing area was, and it turned out to be on the side of a hill. Landing was no real problem. I paid the people that were there, and we got ready to take off. The pilot was not as big or as heavy as me, but heavier than some of the others. So together we had quite a bit of weight with the machine guns, the rockets, the lead, and this little single engine. We sat at the top of the hill and he said, "I don't think we've got enough engine power to go up the hill and get enough airspeed. So we're going to have to go downhill." And we came down the hill, building up airspeed. I felt us leave the ground. We started to hear pop, pop, pop. The pilot noticed that he was losing fuel. We had taken a couple of rounds in the fuel tank. And then we began to come down again. We come back down right at the foot of the hill, bounced up in the air, bounced back down on the other side of the hill, and go plowing into this grassy area. The pilot shouts to get out, and as I do, I look over and I notice that the fuel in the wing is dripping. I try to climb out. I'm in the back seat of a two-seat plane here, but got stuck between the front seat and the doorway, had to back out, and then literally dove over the front seat, out the door, rolled on the ground away from the plane. And as we stood there looking at the plane, waiting to see if it's going to go up in flames, I remember that I probably have about $20,000 in military payment certificates and piastres still in the plane. And the Army is awful if you lose the money on these pay runs. We've been warned over and over again. I can just see it burning up and having to try to explain that, that this money burned away. I was able to go back and retrieve the bag, and then it occurs to me, I may have to stay in this place this night because that NVA battalion is still out there. How am I going to get out of here now that our plane is unable to fly? So we immediately begin calling for help, but now they have to fly another plane out with another pilot to get me, and I have to complete the pay run. I complete the pay run, and I go back to Saigon. One of the buildings that's been taken over in downtown Saigon is the headquarters of the finance branch of the Army. I go to turn in the money that I have left and the signed slips for people who've collected it. I get to the office in the morning, we get the bag, the money is in it, take it to the sergeant who's responsible for checking the signatures, and he stops at one point. Oh, he says, "We got a problem." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "You see here, the official signature for this sergeant is John J. Jones. He signed it J. James Jones. That's an incorrect signature. I can't accept it. Can't accept it. He says, you can't turn in the money. You can't turn in the pay slips. You've got to go back and get the right signature. That would have been bad enough, except when I look at J. Jones, or whatever his name was, he's at this outpost where we crashed the plane. And so theoretically, I'm supposed to go back and get a new signature from this guy. I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, this is ridiculous. I said, I'm going to just, no, he says, you can't do that. You can't just sign it yourself. You know, this would really be in trouble. So I have to take everything back. I get together with my pilot. I'll tell you one thing, he said, that's going to happen is no way am I going back in there with you in the plane. He says, give me the stuff. I'll go, I'll fly in there. I'll get the signature. And that was fine with me. So we entered this room. Around the table were perhaps a dozen visitors, most of the military, mentioning that I had recently been an advisor at the province level in South Vietnam. People stopped and looked at me, and one said, I've always wondered what happens at the province level. In walked the man we had evidently been waiting for, who was disheveled, although he wore a very preppy blue pinstripe suit. He sat down at the table, put his head in his hands, rubbed his eyes a bit, and said, you'll have to excuse me, I've been up in the war room all night. The president wants to know what's going on. Somebody said to him, well, what's the latest news? And he looked at him and he said, we don't know. We just don't know. None of our people are reporting in. This news that not even the CIA knew what was happening. We had probably gotten more reports through the military channels than they were getting. There's no doubt in my mind that in the short run, the United States could have won, quote, the war in Vietnam by taking it over and running it. To do that, however, they would have had to have become the colonial rulers. And in the long run, we could never win at that. We had, in many ways, a connection with some of the population, which saw us as a useful and positive force, but who also had to deal with this kind of corrupt or inefficient leadership. Someone once asked me, is what we hear about Vietnam true? And my answer used to be, everything you ever heard about Vietnam is true in some way. None of us had the same experience. None of us went through exactly the same kinds of learning. But that's been the Vietnam that I knew and the stories that I tell.